Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening up an ancient document that honestly feels incredibly modern just because of its raw emotional reality. We're looking at the Apostle Paul's deeply personal letter, 2 Corinthians. If you've ever wanted to understand what it actually means to find profound strength right smack in the middle of your deepest weaknesses, well, you are in exactly the right place. So, let's dive into this.
Have you ever felt like you're just hanging by a thread? If you've ever been through a genuinely tough season, just totally exhausted and feeling like you've got absolutely nothing left in the tank, this text is built for you. 2 Corinthians isn't some sterile academic treatise. It's a letter written for people experiencing real-world hardship. It is basically a survival guide about perseverance, vulnerability, and just holding on.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 5 key areas. 1. Setting the historical stage. 2. A uniquely vulnerable letter. 3. Confronting the super apostles. 4. Key themes of 2 Corinthians. And 5. Lessons for today. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Setting the historical stage. The Crucible of Corinth.
Okay, so we really have to understand the messiness on the ground to appreciate the words on the page. About a year or so after writing 1 Corinthians, so this is around AD 55 or 56, Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church became severely strained, like really tense. Notice the timeline here. Paul makes what he actually calls a painful visit. He was likely confronted there, his authority was questioned, and it just went so poorly that it prompted him to write a severe letter. Now, that letter is actually lost to history, but we know it was delivered by his associate Titus. Then, finally, an emotional breakthrough. Titus returns with good news that the Corinthians had actually repented. So as Paul sits in Macedonia, likely Philippi, getting ready to visit them again, he writes 2 Corinthians. It acts as both a follow-up and a heartfelt defense. I mean, talk about an emotional roller coaster, right?
Section 2. A uniquely vulnerable letter. The Wounded Warrior.
In this letter, we actually see Paul transition from being this pure theologian to an incredibly vulnerable wounded warrior. His authorship here is completely undisputed, and honestly, his fingerprints are everywhere. He's not just teaching, he's acting as a spiritual father. He openly lists his extreme hardships. We're talking about being shipwrecked, physically beaten, and constantly living under immense pressure. Yet, right alongside all that pain, he talks about finding profound comfort from God. And because of all this, you'll notice his tone shifts pretty wildly throughout the text. Literally, one moment he's offering warm encouragement, and the very next, he's dealing out sharp confrontation. It's what makes the text feel so incredibly personal and real.
Section 3. Confronting the super apostles. Factions in a diverse church.
So the church in Corinth was incredibly diverse. You had Jews, Gentiles, the rich, the poor, but, as we know, diversity without unity usually leads to factions. Enter the super apostles. These were charismatic rival leaders who deliberately came in and undermined Paul. They basically told the Corinthians that Paul just wasn't impressive, eloquent, or spiritual enough to be a true apostle. This charismatic threat really forced Paul's hand. He had to write this letter to reconcile with his friends, defend his life's work, and encourage them to stay the course.
Just look at this contrast. On one side, you have the super apostles. They are flashy, charismatic, superficially impressive, and always claiming superiority. Then, on the other side, you have Paul. He's leaning into his self-described weakness, bearing the literal scars of severe physical hardships, and relying entirely on God's power rather than his own glowing resume. It is a classic battle between human swagger and divine substance.
Section 4. Key themes of 2 Corinthians. The power of paradox.
Moving on from the historical drama, we find some of the most brilliant thematic paradoxes in all of ancient literature, starting right in chapter 1 with this absolutely beautiful quote. He calls God the Father of mercies and God of all comfort. Now remember, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, and let's be honest, often in our world today too, suffering was viewed as shameful. A lot of times it was seen as a sign of divine punishment. But Paul completely flips the script here. He frames his affliction not as a failure, but as the very platform for experiencing and sharing God's grace. He receives comfort so that he can literally turn right around and comfort others.
Then, in chapter 3, Paul uses this incredibly striking metaphor of a veil to contrast two totally different eras of faith. He describes the Old Covenant as being symbolized by Moses wearing a veil over his face to hide God's fading glory. But the New Covenant? Well, through Christ, the Spirit gives life, and that veil is entirely removed. The glory of God is no longer hidden away, it's right out in the open for believers to see and be transformed by.
And chapter 4 gives us this amazing image. Paul calls believers jars of clay, carrying a profound treasure. Think about a clay jar in the ancient world for a second. It was cheap, fragile, common, and easily broken. That's us, he says. But inside that fragile, totally unimpressive shell is the extraordinary, unstoppable power of the gospel. It just proves that the real power comes from God, not from our own flashy exteriors.
But Paul doesn't just stay up in the clouds of theology, right? He brings it right down to earth in chapters 8 and 9. He connects all this grace to practical, real-world action, specifically generosity and giving. He urges the Corinthians to finish a financial collection they had promised for the struggling church back in Jerusalem. And how does he motivate them? By pointing to the Macedonians? The Macedonians were experiencing deep poverty themselves, but they gave with unbelievable generosity. He's showing them that true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about how freely you give.
Finally, we hit one of the most famous and honestly debated passages in the entire text. In chapter 12, Paul's thorn in the flesh. Scholars have argued for centuries about what this actually was. Was it a chronic physical illness? Was it relentless spiritual opposition? The truth is, we don't know for sure, but what we do know is its purpose. It kept Paul humble. Paul pleaded for it to be removed, but God's response was simple and profound. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.
Section 5. Lessons for today. The crown.
So how does this ancient text act as a crown for our lives right now? Really, it comes down to these three deeply human applications. First, vulnerability is actually a strength. You don't have to pretend to have it all together, because God absolutely prefers to work through our weakness. Second, generosity reflects God's heart. Whether it's your money, your time, or even just your encouragement, giving freely is the most tangible expression of love. And third, God's grace is sufficient. Whatever your personal thorn happens to be right now, this ancient text promises that God's grace will sustain you through it.
For those of you who love to dig a bit deeper into this stuff, this table outlines some really fantastic resources. Whether you want an accessible commentary from Paul Barnett, you want to explore the theology of suffering with J. Richard Middleton, or maybe you want to dive into a 12-week study guide, there's a lot of great material here. Now, it is worth noting that some critics debate the letter's structure, suggesting it might actually be a compilation of a few different letters patched together. But you know what? Even if that theory holds up, the overarching, magnificent themes of reconciliation and finding strength and weakness just bind the entire text together beautifully.
We have definitely covered a lot of ground today, but the journey does not stop here. Next time, we are heading straight into Galatians. It is an absolute powerhouse of a letter, fiery, intense, and features Paul defending the core of his message with literally everything he's got. You definitely won't want to miss that explainer. If you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming deep dives.
Before we go, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. How might your greatest weakness actually be your greatest platform? 2 Corinthians proves that God meets us right in the middle of our mess. Your broken clay jar might just be the very thing that lets the light shine through. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.